I talked about aggregating impacts in three dimensions: time, space, and risk, discounting, equity, and uncertainty, if you like. What I'm going to do in this final chapter is put them all together and give some thoughts about how to pick these parameters. So the first graph that we looked at had no concerns for equity, no concerns for uncertainty. We looked at the social cost of carbon on the vertical axis, and we looked at the curvature of the utility function on the horizontal axis. And we found that the pure rate of time preference had an unambiguous effect. The green line lies above the blue line, lies above the brown line. The more you care about the future, the more you care about climate change, the higher the carbon tax you would want to impose. And then we talked about the Ramsey rule for discounting, which says that your consumption discount rate equals your pure rate of time preference. That's the different colored lines, plus the curvature of your utility function, the rate of risk aversion, times the growth rate of consumption. And that curvature of the utility function is on the horizontal axis, and what we have in this particular case is that the more curved your utility function is, the harder you discount the future, and therefore the lower the optimal tax that you would like to impose on your greenhouse gases. So that was the first picture that we looked at, and then the second picture that we looked at, we introduced equity weights, and essentially that means that we place a higher weight on the monetary impacts that would fall on the poor. And if you do that, what you see is that for a relative, the role of the pure rate of time preference doesn't change. For a relatively small rate of risk aversion, relatively flat utility function, you see that the discounting effect dominates. That is, the higher the rate of risk aversion, the lower the social cost of carbon. But for very high rates of risk aversion, it actually becomes inequity aversion, and you start putting a lot of emphasis on the poor, and that effect dominates. Then we introduced uncertainty. We left out concerns for equity for the moment, and you see that the rate of risk aversion, the curvature of the utility function, again has an ambiguous effect on the social cost of carbon. That is, if it starts low, first you drive down the social cost of carbon because the discount effect dominates through the Ramsey rule. But if the rate of risk aversion gets pretty high, then your tail effect, the emphasis that you put on really bad risks, start to dominate, and the social cost of carbon skyrockets. Now we've seen these three figures. What we haven't seen is the final figure, and that is if we have concern both for equity and for risk, and that is the graph that just popped up. There's two things I want to say about this graph. First, it looks much more like the graph with equity, much more like the graph with uncertainty than like the graph with equity. So it much more resembles the graph that is immediately to its left than the graph that is immediately above it, from which you can deduce that, at least in this particular model and in this particular parameterization and for this particular set of scenarios, risk is a much more important consideration when setting climate policy than equity. The second thing that I like to say with this, if you recall the graph with equity in but no uncertainty, we're actually, for some bits of the parameter space, we're actually arguing for a PGU subsidy rather than a PGU tax. That completely disappears. if you care a lot about the poor, even if you focus on the short run, there are negative aspects, negative risks for the poor as well, and they are actually pretty substantial. If you compare the two bottom graphs, then the brown curve, for instance, where you really focus on the relative short term because your pure rate of time preference is 3%. But if you look at the effect of the rate of risk aversion around 2.5 to 3, you see that the equity weights, when you consider all the uncertainties about climate change, actually increases your social cost of carbon rather than turns it negative if you ignore the risks. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. Those positive aspects of CO2 fertilization, yes, are there, are short run, primarily fall on the poor, that's all good, but they're relatively certain and they are constrained from above. But the negative risks, particularly in health, particularly to do with infectious diseases and heat stress, those things are much more important if you look at the full range of potential outcomes rather than just focus on the best guess and the central tendency. So much for the sensitivity of estimates of the social cost of carbon and therefore estimates of our optimal course of action for greenhouse gas emission reduction and its dependence on the ethical parameters in your welfare function. The question that remains is, if the social cost of carbon is so sensitive to the pure rate of time preference and to our rate of risk aversion and our rate of inequity aversion, what parameters should we pick? Because the social cost of carbon that you see displayed on the bottom graph here and the bottom right graph is that your social cost of carbon lies somewhere between essentially 0 and something that is greater than 1000, and that is not much of policy guidance. Essentially says, well, I don't know, you pick a number. Now there's 3 ways of going about it. The first you see here, some people argue for $100 per ton of carbon tax, and therefore what they should do is pick a pure rate of time preference of 1% and a rate of risk aversion of 1/2, right? Then you're roughly at 200. So you can work your way back from a desired carbon tax to a particular configuration of your welfare function, and there you have your answer. That is entirely the wrong way of going about it. There's essentially 2 ways of arguing for a particular set of parameters. These parameters are crucially important, so these arguments are crucially important too. One way of going about this is to say, well, essentially the rate of pure time preference measures how much we care about the future. The rate of inequity aversion governs how much we care about others, or about the income distribution, if you like. The rate of risk aversion measures how much we care about risk and uncertainty. And really what we should do is think hard about how much we should care about the future generations, how much we should care about other people, how much we should care about risk. Those are very difficult questions. So most people say, oh, I'm going to seek guidance from people I think are clever and wise, and I'm going to see what they say about it. So you can rely on ethical guidance, you can rely on religious guidance. So you may admire Socrates or Aristotle, And you may wonder, what did these guys have to say about this? And if it comes to time discounting, the discount rate, Aristotle actually argued, presumably inspired by Socrates, argued very hard against usury, that is the a discount rate of 0. We should not discount the future because it is 0. You may argue, well, what do I care about Aristotle? Actually, I don't like Aristotle because he was also anti-woman and pro-slavery, so why should I care about him? And instead I'll turn to Jesus, who I like much better. And what did Jesus have to say about time preference? That's actually very unclear. The New Testament was mostly silent about this. The only sort of relevant piece is when Jesus threw out the money changers from the temple. And that can be because he was against bankers and people lending money to other people. That's one interpretation of this action. But another interpretation is that Jesus was against the mixing of religious and commercial activities. So that's pretty unclear. Muhammad, the prophet, is much clearer about these things, and essentially adopted the same position as Aristotle did, that is, you shall not discount, right? You cannot raise levy interest on loans, and therefore your discount rate should be 0. You can also ask, what did Johnny Rotten say? And Johnny Rotten, of course, argued that it's better to burn out than to fade away. That is a pretty high discount rate. And so on and so forth, right? So you can go to your favorite thought leader and ask them, what would Lord Stern do? What would Lao Tzu do? What would Lady Gaga do? And the lady here takes her appropriate place among the presidents of the United States. And for some things there is clear guidance in these religious or ethical texts. If it comes to care about others, Jesus had a pretty strong position, as did Muhammad. If it comes to risk aversion, none of the people that are here, that are listed here, actually had a very great thing to say about this. So that is one way of going about picking these parameters. The other way of going about it is to look at what do people do in their daily lives. And we're not every day making decisions about greenhouse gases and climate change, but we do make everyday decisions about things that have a payoff in the future, things that are terribly uncertain, and things that impact others as much as ourselves. And that comes in our voting behavior, but it also comes in our behavior if we decide to go to college, or if we decide to cheat on exams, or if we decide, even though we have a reason to suspect that we're infected with COVID-19, that we go to the pub or take the tube nonetheless, right? All these decisions affect ourselves and others, and we're actually never quite certain about what the results would be. So from looking at how people behave, or putting people in the lab and let them play games and do experiments on them, or let them fill out questionnaires, we can actually deduce imperfectly what people's preferences about time, risk and others are, and we can let our decisions be guided by this. The bad thing about going for the sort of the religious ethical route is that essentially you run the risk of the government saying, this is what your value should be, and you get into a very paternalistic mode of government. Government decides how much you should care about the future. Revealed preferences do not have that risk. There are issues that mean it's very difficult to measure these things. Very, very difficult to measure these things with any sort of accuracy or with any sort of external validity. And of course, much more importantly, the decisions that you make in your life as a private citizen are not necessarily the same as the decisions you would like your government to make for you. And that has to do with the aggregation of risk. It has to do with the provision of public goods, probably more pertinently here, that we actually, in those cases, we do want the government to behave differently than you do, because the risk profile of government investments is lower because it aggregates over a great many people, but also we do want the government to correct the under-provision of public goods, and we do want the government to correct externalities, and as far as externalities in public goods affect our decisions over time or our decisions over others, the public goods aspect is actually pretty important, or investments over time, our individual preferences for these things should deviate from our social preferences for these things. Which actually, and I'm going to conclude this by throwing up my hands and say, well, we can't measure these things, and if we can measure these things, we actually do not measure them. We do not actually measure what we need to measure, so that may not be a clever route to go down. Whereas following ethical guidance, you actually get into this argument like, who are they to decide these things for us? So the guidance there that I can give you is just be very, very careful in these things, and don't pick a number, because whatever number you pick, somebody can rightfully attack you, and it's much better to give sensitivities and show results for a range of these key parameters. What I do want to argue is that you should be consistent there. That if you're, and I've made this argument twice already, in this particular lecture and before as well, that if you are going to argue for a high discount rate, then that also implies that you have a high discount rate for other public goods. And if you're going to argue for a low discount rate because of climate, then you should also argue for a low discount rate for investments in education and investment in pensions and so on and so forth. And if you are going to argue that we should pay great attention to the impacts of climate change on Africa, which I think we should, then the implication is that you should also pay great attention to the impacts of your trade policy on Africa, and you should also pay great attention to the impacts of your immigration policy on Africa. And consistency there, I think, is a great good and maybe another way to guide your choice of parameters, or maybe not, because if we look at what our immigration policy does to people in Africa, it actually almost suggests that we have a utility function that tries to kill as many Africans as possible. So perhaps this is more a way of saying we should reform our immigration policy rather than make our climate policy. We should make our immigration policy consistent with our climate policy rather than our climate policy consistent with our immigration policy if it comes to care for people in faraway countries. That's all I wanted to say.